And let's begin with Back to the Future, the Steven Spielberg production, which has broken box office records all over America and will, I suspect, do much the same thing here. It's an engaging, hugely entertaining story of a small-town American teenager, Michael J. Fox.
There's a scene in Back to the Future that everyone has watched dozens of times without realizing what it means. At the beginning of the film, Marty McFly meets Doc Brown in a parking lot at Twin Pines Mall. They set up the time travel experiment, things go wrong, and Marty escapes to 1955. Standard time travel movie stuff. But when Marty returns to 1985 at the end of the film, something changed. The parking lot is still there. The stores are still there. Everything looks identical except for one detail. The sign doesn't say Twin Pines Mall anymore. It says Lone Pine Mall. One word is different, and that single word proves that everything you think you understand about the movie's timeline is wrong. Marty didn't just change his family when he went back to 1955. He changed the entire world. He's not living in his original timeline anymore, and he never can again. But to understand why this matters and how it almost didn't happen at all, we need to go back to 1980, when Back to the Future was the script that nobody in Hollywood wanted to touch. The impossible movie. Bob Gale got the idea for Back to the Future in 1980 while flipping through his father's high school yearbook. He wondered if they would have been friends as teenagers, and that simple question turned into a time travel screenplay. He and Robert Zemeckis polished the script for months, convinced they had a guaranteed blockbuster. Then they started pitching it to studios. Every single one rejected them. Disney's feedback was particularly crushing. An executive called the mother-son attraction inappropriate and disturbing. Columbia claimed audiences were done with time travel after recent sci-fi failures. The script spent 4 years in development hell, collecting rejection letters while Gale and Zemeckis watched their careers stall. The problem wasn't just the premise. Studios saw Zemeckis as box office poison. His comedy Used Cars had flopped hard. Before that, 1941, a big Spielberg-produced war comedy, lost millions. Executives viewed him as talented but cursed, making interesting films nobody wanted to see. No studio would risk an expensive sci-fi movie on that track record. Everything changed in 1984 when Spielberg personally intervened. He told Universal he'd produce Back to the Future, but only with Zemeckis directing. Universal agreed reluctantly, then handed them a $19 million budget. For a special effects-heavy time travel film, that was laughably tight. Zemeckis got brutal instructions. Shoot fast, keep it cheap, minimal reshoots, one take whenever possible. Filming started in November 1984 with Eric Stoltz as Marty McFly. Stoltz was a method actor who brought serious dramatic intensity to every scene. For 6 weeks, they shot skateboard sequences, school scenes, chunks of the 1955 storyline. But Zemeckis realized Stoltz was giving the wrong performance. Brilliant, but wrong. He played Marty like a troubled teen in a heavy drama. The movie needed lightness, energy, and charm. Stoltz made it feel like a therapy session. Zemeckis made a career-ending gamble. He told Spielberg and Universal they had to fire Stoltz and start over. 6 weeks of footage, already paid for, would be trashed. The recasting would cost over $3 million. Universal could have killed the production. Instead, they called Michael J. Fox, who'd rejected the role months earlier due to his family ties commitment. Fox's solution was insane. He filmed Family Ties until 6 p.m., then worked on Back to the Future until 2 or 3 in the morning. He slept 2 to 3 hours a night for 3 months. Fox later admitted he barely remembers filming because exhaustion put his brain on autopilot. The scene that changes everything. Now here's where everything you think you know about Back to the Future falls apart. In the opening sequence, Marty meets Doc at the Twin Pines Mall parking lot. The name is visible on a large sign. 2 pine trees in the logo. Twin Pines. Simple enough. Then Marty travels to 1955, and the DeLorean crashes through a barn owned by Old Man Peabody, a farmer who shoots at Marty thinking he's an alien invader. Peabody has a son in a Davy Crockett outfit, and they're standing in front of 2 pine trees. Peabody shouts something about his pine trees as Marty drives away. It's a throwaway moment that lasts maybe 3 seconds. Easy to miss if you're paying attention to Marty's panicked escape. But when Marty returns to 1985 in the film's climax, he arrives back at the same parking lot where the movie started. Except the sign is different. It doesn't say Twin Pines Mall anymore. It says Lone Pine Mall. Because in 1955, Marty ran over one of Old Man Peabody's pine trees with the DeLorean. Peabody only had 1 pine tree left when he sold his land to developers decades later. So they named the mall Lone Pine instead of Twin Pines. This wasn't a continuity error. This wasn't a fun Easter egg for observant viewers. This was the writers showing you that Marty fundamentally altered his timeline in ways he doesn't even realize. Think about what this means. The mall name changed, which means the entire history of that property changed. Old Man Peabody's story changed. The developers who bought the land decades later made different branding decisions. Everyone who ever went to that mall knew it as Lone Pine, not Twin Pines. Their memories are different from the original timeline. And this is just one tiny visible change. How many other changes happened that we can't see? What else is different in this new 1985 that Marty returned to? The evidence is everywhere once you start looking. Marty's family is completely different. In the original timeline, his father George was a weak, pathetic figure who let his supervisor Biff push him around. His mother Lorraine was miserable and drank too much. His siblings were failures living at home with no prospects. But when Marty returns from 1955, his father is a confident, successful science fiction author. His mother is fit, happy, and vibrant. Biff isn't his father's boss anymore. He's practically a servant who waxes their cars. The family lives in a nicer house, with better furniture, and genuine affection for each other. Here's the disturbing part. Marty doesn't seem shocked by any of this. He's pleased, definitely. He's happy his family is better off, but he's not confused or disoriented. He doesn't ask questions about how long his father has been a successful writer, or when Biff became so subservient. The implication is clear. Marty's memories changed along with the timeline. He remembers this version of his family as if it's always been this way. The only thing anchoring him to the original timeline is the photograph, which kept changing throughout the film, as his interference in the past threatened his own existence. But there's an even darker implication that the movie never addresses. If Marty's memories changed to match the new timeline, and his family is completely different, then what happened to the Marty McFly who was born and raised in this new, better timeline? The Marty who grew up with a confident father and happy mother, who never experienced the dysfunction of the original timeline. Our Marty, the one from the original timeline, came back and essentially replaced him. That other Marty, the one native to this new timeline, just vanished. He went to meet Doc at the mall and never came home. From that family's perspective, if their memories hadn't also changed, their son disappeared and an alternate version took his place. The movie gets even more complex when you realize that Doc Brown knew everything. In 1955, Marty writes Doc a letter warning him that he'll be shot by terrorists in 1985. Doc tears up the letter, saying he can't know too much about his own future because it might contaminate the timeline. But then, when Marty returns to 1985 and the terrorists shoot Doc, he stands up wearing a bulletproof vest. He pulls out the taped-together letter and grins. He didn't destroy it. He pieced it back together and read it. Then he spent 30 years preparing for that exact moment, buying a bulletproof vest and positioning himself to survive the shooting. Doc manipulated the timeline just as much as Marty did, if not more. This creates a fascinating paradox. If Doc read the letter and knew he would be shot, did he change the timeline by surviving? Or was his survival always part of the timeline because Marty had already traveled back? The movie suggests that time travel in this universe operates on a single, self-correcting timeline, rather than branching multiverses. Changes ripple outward and backward, altering everything in their path. But certain events seem fixed, like Marty's parents still getting together at the dance, just in a different way. The rules aren't entirely clear, which is probably intentional. The ambiguity makes the time travel feel more mysterious and less like a mechanic's manual. Hidden details and foreshadowing. The uncomfortable truth about Back to the Future is that it's a movie where a teenage boy has to make sure his mother falls in love with his father, which means he has to deflect his mother's romantic interest in himself. The studio executives were terrified this would make audiences uncomfortable, and they were probably right to worry. Lorraine's attraction to Marty, who she knows as Calvin Klein, is played for comedy, but it walks a very fine line. There's a scene in the car where she's clearly about to kiss him before George interrupts, and the movie cuts away at just the right moment. Zemeckis knew exactly how far he could push it before it stopped being funny and became deeply weird. What makes this work is that Marty is clearly horrified the entire time. He's not enjoying the attention. He's desperately trying to redirect Lorraine's feelings toward George without being cruel about it. The movie treats the situation as absurd and awkward rather than titillating, which is the only way it could work. But it's still remarkable that a major studio released a family-friendly summer blockbuster with this premise. Imagine pitching that today. A teenager goes back in time and his mother tries to sleep with him. It sounds like a disaster. The fact that Back to the Future made it work is a testament to the skill of everyone involved. There's a political joke in the movie that has a strange real-world echo. When Marty tells 1955 Doc Brown that Ronald Reagan is president in 1985, Doc laughs in disbelief. Ronald Reagan? The actor? And who's vice president? Jerry Lewis. The joke is that in 1955, Reagan was just a B-movie actor who hosted a television show. The idea of him becoming president seemed absurd. But here's the thing. When they filmed that scene in 1984, Ronald Reagan was actually president. He'd been in office for 3 years. The joke works because the audience knows Reagan became president, so Doc's disbelief is funny. But Reagan himself loved the joke. He quoted the movie in his 1986 State of the Union address, making a reference to Back to the Future that got huge laughs from Congress. A time travel movie joke ended up in presidential speechwriting. Reality is weird. One of the most common criticisms of Back to the Future is a perceived plot hole about how Doc Brown found Marty after the time travel experiment went wrong. The Libyan terrorists show up, shoot Doc, and Marty escapes to 1955. But then, at the end of the film, Doc shows up in the DeLorean, alive and well, having read Marty's warning letter. How did he know where and when to find Marty? The answer is actually shown in the opening scene, but it's easy to miss. Doc has a video camera recording everything that happens in the parking lot. He filmed the entire experiment, including the moment Marty disappeared. Later, after reading Marty's letter and surviving the shooting, Doc would have reviewed that footage. He knew exactly when Marty left, and by calculating the DeLorean's fuel capacity and the time circuits, could figure out when Marty would return. The movie explained it. We just weren't paying close enough attention. The enchantment under the sea dance is another example of what seems like lucky coincidence, but is actually careful planning. Marty needs his parents to kiss at the dance to ensure his existence, and he needs to get back to Doc at exactly the right time for the lightning bolt to strike the clock tower. Everything lines up perfectly. Too perfectly, some critics argue. But the movie establishes that Doc knew about the dance because Marty told him the story of how his parents met. Doc calculated the exact time the lightning would strike because he had the flyer showing the date and time. The seeming coincidences were actually Doc running calculations and orchestrating events to align. The lightning rod connects at precisely 10:04 p.m. because Doc knew it would and planned accordingly. There are visual details scattered throughout the film that reward multiple viewings. The J.C. Penney store in 1955 becomes part of the Two Pines Mall location, a visual gag connecting the two time periods. Peabody's son is dressed as Davy Crockett, a reference to 1950s pop culture, but also a hint about American mythology and time. In the new 1985 timeline, the car dealership that was selling used cars in the original timeline now sells Toyotas, suggesting the economic changes of the 1980s played out differently. When Marty auditions for the school band and gets rejected for being too loud, it foreshadows the moment in 1955 when he plays Chuck Berry-style rock and roll and literally blows the amplifier. The movie is full of these small touches that add texture and reward attention. The box office miracle. Universal Pictures released Back to the Future. On July 3, 1985, the Wednesday before 4th of July weekend. The studio had almost no faith in it commercially. They'd spent relatively little on marketing compared to their other summer releases. The film was opening against Rambo: First Blood Part 2, which was already a massive hit, and the new James Bond film, A View to a Kill. Industry insiders expected Back to the Future to have a decent opening weekend and then fade quickly. That's what happened to most mid-budget genre films in the 80s. You opened, you made some money, you disappeared to make room for the next thing. The opening weekend box office was $11.1 million. Solid, but not spectacular. Universal executives breathed a sigh of relief that they hadn't lost money, but they weren't popping champagne. Then, something unusual happened. The second weekend, the film's box office increased instead of dropping. More people went to see it in week 2 than week 1. Word of mouth was spreading like wildfire. Audiences were telling their friends, their families, random people they met that they had to see this movie. The critical reviews were strong, but this was something beyond good reviews. This was a cultural moment happening in real time. Back to the Future stayed at number 1 at the box office for 11 consecutive weeks. 11 weeks. In an era before streaming or home video really took off, films could have long theatrical runs if they connected with audiences. But 11 weeks at number 1 was nearly unprecedented. The film eventually grossed $381 million worldwide on a $19 million budget. It became the highest-grossing film of 1985, beating out Rambo, Rocky IV, and everything else Hollywood threw at theaters that year. For a movie that every studio rejected, for a script that sat in development hell for 4 years, the success was almost unbelievable. The cultural impact was immediate and weird. The word heavy, which Marty uses as slang for serious or intense, became part of teenage vocabulary overnight. DeLorean Motor Company was already defunct, but interest in buying used DeLoreans spiked as people wanted to own the time machine car. Skateboard sales increased dramatically because kids wanted to ride boards and grab onto trucks like Marty does in the film. There were reports of injuries from children attempting the stunt, which led to some hand-wringing from parent groups, but only made the movie more appealing to its target audience. Huey Lewis and the News had a #1 hit with The Power of Love, the song that plays during the opening skateboard sequence. The soundtrack album sold millions of copies. Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale insisted publicly that Back to the Future was a complete story with no need for a sequel. They'd told the story they wanted to tell, and they were done. Universal Pictures saw $381 million in worldwide box office and had a different perspective. They offered Zemeckis and Gale a deal to make 2 sequels, Back to the Future Part 2 and Part 3, filmed back to back. The deal was too good to refuse. Interestingly, the original theatrical release of Back to the Future doesn't end with "to be continued." That was added later to VHS and television versions after the sequels were greenlit. The original audiences saw the film as a standalone story, which makes its narrative completeness even more impressive.